book passage on a Tuesday evening. My name is Melissa, and I am here. Warm up here. I'm here to introduce our author this evening. We are so honored to have with us this incredible writer, Kevin Powers, here with his debut award-winning novel, The Yellow Birds. The Yellow Birds has already received the Penn Hemingway Award for First Fiction, the Guardian First Book Award. It was a finalist for the National Book Award, and most recently, the Anisfield Wolf Prize. We are not surprised here at Book Passage that this book has been bestowed with so many fantastic reviews and prizes. This is what can happen when you put a poet in the war. Kevin served in the U.S. Army in 2004 and 2005 in Iraq, where he was deployed as a machine gunner in Mosul. And after his time in the service, he went on to graduate from the University of Texas at Austin as a Michener Fellow in Poetry. I had The Yellow Birds on my very tall and leaning stack of books for some time. I knew that it was a book I needed to read, and I finally did, in a day's time. And I can't tell you how moved and awestruck I was by this book. The language in this story is so lyrical and evocative. When Kevin writes about the sky, it's not an ordinary desert sky. It's a muddy mackerel sky, or a sky the color of brittle charcoal. Each passage in the story feels raw and true, balancing beauty and truth alongside the unspeakable horrors of war. This war that we all know and don't know. Kevin is here to talk about his journey of writing The Yellow Birds, and we couldn't be more excited for him over its success. May we please all give Kevin Powers a warm welcome.
Hey, all. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here and so happy that y'all are here too. This is really nice for me to be able to come here and talk about the book and introduce it to people who haven't read it. And for those who have, if you have questions, I will be really pleased to answer them to the best of my ability, such as it is. I thought I would just kind of start a little bit by talking about, how I came to write the book. I will certainly read from the book, and if you haven't read it, give you a kind of idea of what the story is. And then again, I hope we can just kind of have a conversation after that. So again, I'm really very honored that you've all taken time out of your day to come here and listen to me. So this is a great pleasure for me. I am a veteran of the war in Iraq. I was there for a year, from early 2004 to early 2005. When I came home from that experience, I was frequently asked, basically one question, a variation on that question by family, friends, people who, strangers who found out that I was a veteran, and that question was, what was it like over there? And it occurred to me that I didn't have an answer that was satisfactory even to myself. And it seemed to me that people were asking for something beyond what could be found in the newspaper, something beyond what you could watch on the kind of 24-hour news networks, something that was, an answer that existed on a more human scale. So I tried to find a story, find a way of telling that story that would focus on the individual experience, on the emotional experience, the challenges of having to live in that kind of intense violence, both as a participant and a witness, and the challenges that you're faced with when you're trying to re-enter society, when they're trying to become a person again, to become a moral person again. How do you navigate that environment? So the story that I tell in the book is, I mean, it's a very simple story. It's about two very young men, not very far from being boys, one of whom makes a promise to the other's mother that he'll protect him and keep him safe. It's an irresponsible promise. It's a promise hastily made. And it's a promise that he can't keep. So the book is told in alternating chapters, about half of which take place during the war when they're both together, and about half of which take place after our narrator, John Bartle, has returned home, and he's attempting to kind of find his place in the world. The first passage that I'm going to read tonight will kind of outline the problem, begins to, you know, his kind of attempts to excavate his own history, the choices that he's made, to figure out what he's responsible for, and how can he possibly atone for the choices that he made and had to make, and the consequences that resulted from those choices. And the second passage that I'll read takes place just after he's returned home, when he's again trying to locate himself in the landscape. He's back in the environment he grew up in, an environment that should be familiar to him, but is so very strange. So with that, I think I'll just begin. And again, I'm so pleased to be here, and I'll be happy to answer questions after I read just a bit. Mrs. LaDonna Murphy, rural mail carrier, would have only needed to read the first word of the letter to know that it had not been written by her son. The truth is, she had not received all that many letters from him, so when I wrote it, I took a guess that she might not have that much to compare it to. He'd rarely been more than a few miles away from her during the first 17 years of his life. About 5 miles, depending on where Daniel was when she reached the farthest stop on her mail route, if measured as the crow flies. 7 if we allow for depth at midnight during those 3 months he worked in the Ship Mountain Mine after he graduated from the Bluefield Vocational and Technical School. Then on to Benning in the fall, the farthest he'd ever been from home, where Daniel would write her a few short notes before lights out, scrawling out his thoughts about the redness of the clay, the pleasure he took in sleeping under those endless Georgia stars, and when time allowed, making space for the assurances that boys like me and Daniel always end up sending to our families, assurances that were as much for us as for them. The rest of his life he'd spent with me, 10 months, give or take, from the time he appeared next to me in formation that day in New Jersey, with snow so high over our boots that our left and right faces made only a whisper in the snow. 10 months, give or take, from that day to the day he died. It might seem like a short time, but my whole life since has merely been a digression from those days, which now hang over me like a quarrel that will never be resolved. I'd had this idea once that you had to grow old before you died. I still feel like there's some truth to it, because Daniel Murphy had grown old in the 10 months I'd known him. And perhaps it was a need for something to make sense that caused me to pick up a pencil and write a letter to a dead boy's mother, to write it in his name, having known him plenty long enough to know it was not his way to call his mother Mom. I'd done a lot, really. I'd known that snow comes early in the year in the mountains where Daniel was from, November, sure, and sometimes as early as October. But I only found out later that she'd read that letter with snow falling all around her, that she'd set it on the seat next to her while she mushed her old right-hand drive Jeep up and down the switchbacks on her route, carving clean tracks through the white erasure that had fallen all throughout the night before. And that as she pulled down the long gravel path leading to their little house, on the winter dormant apple orchard Daniel had talked about so often, she kept sneaking glances at the return address. She must have taken those glances with an unusual level of skepticism for a rural mail carrier as experienced as she was, because she thought each time that something different would be written there. When the wheels of her old Jeep finally stopped, and the whole mass of 84 metal slid a few last feet in the snow. She'd taken the letter in both hands and became briefly, terrifyingly happy. At one time, you could have asked me if I thought the snow meant something, and I would have said yes. I might have thought there was some significance to the fact that there had been snow on the day Murph had come into my life, and snow on the day I willed myself into the one that had been taken from him. I may not have believed it, but I'm sure I would have wanted to. It's lovely to think that snow can be special. We're always told it is. Of all those million flakes that fall, no two are alike. Forever and ever, amen. I've spent some time looking out the window of my cabin, watching snowflakes fall like a shot dove's feathers fluttering slowly down to the ground. They all look the same to me. I know it was a terrible thing to write that letter. What I don't know is where it fits in with all of the other terrible things I think about. At some point along the way, I stopped believing in significance. Order became an accident of observation. I've come to accept that parts of life are constant, that just because something happens on 2 different days doesn't make it a goddamn miracle. All I really know for sure is that no matter how long I live, and no matter how I spend that time, those scales aren't ever coming level. Murph's always going to be 18, and he's always going to be dead, and I'll be living with a promise that I couldn't keep. Thank you. So yeah, the second passage that I'm going to read, as I mentioned, he's returned home. He's dealing with, some serious guilt, regret, shame, all of the above, all of the emotions that you can probably imagine he'd be feeling. And he's just trying to, just kind of find out where he is, and not only mentally, spiritually, morally, but also physically. And a good deal happens in between the part I just read and this part, about that much. So, so I'll read this. It's just a couple of pages. That spring, whole days and weeks were slept through and swept into the afternoons, never seeing a soul. I woke at random intervals to hear the school bus down the street loading and unloading different grades and ages of children, telling me the time based on the pitch of their chattering voices. I had deteriorated more than one might expect in the short time I've been home. My only exercise was the 2-mile round trip I made every afternoon to GW's country store for a case of beer. I avoided roads, opting instead for the train tracks that passed by our house on the other side of a long, low berm. The hardwoods canopied above me provided shade, and the light fell through the green branches unceremoniously. The heat had gathered throughout the spring and now became a dense murk in the trellis pathway of the train tracks. Atlantic heat, muggy, thick with mosquitoes. It was quite unlike the heat not far, which had the surprising effect of reducing one to tears in an instant, even after having spent hours broiling in it already. This heat was somehow more American. It confronted you immediately on your stepping out in it. Your breath warmed intolerably, and it seemed you needed to push through it like a swimmer. Sometimes when I reached GW's, I'd wait just inside the wood line until whatever old pickup turned its last rusted quarter panel down the road, and I'd walk into the chime of the double doors through the dust that had left in its wake. I can't really explain what that feeling was like. Shame, I guess. But that wasn't all of it. It was more particular than that. Anyone can feel shame. I remember myself sitting in the dirt under neglected and overgrown brush, afraid of nothing in the world more than having to show myself for what I had become. I wasn't really known around there anyway, but I had the feeling that if I encountered anyone, they would intuit my disgrace and would judge me instantly. Nothing is more isolating than having a particular history. At least that's what I thought. Now I know. All pain is the same, only the details are different. When I got back to the house, my shirt soaked through with sweat and starched again with salt, I put the beer in my closet and walk into the kitchen, where I'd stand for a long time looking out the window onto the haze rising off the pond. I didn't want to broaden the evidence of my existence wider than the brief footprints of moisture on the floor of my mother's modest country kitchen. I looked out the window and saw the street and railroad tracks, the woods beyond the woods, the county of which they were a part, and so on, until it all dissolved into the larger thing. My mother's house becoming every other house as I once had seen it, sitting atop the southern end of the broad river valley, close enough to the mountains that every few years a scared black bear would wander down into the remaining forest, and close enough to the ocean that those early English settlers took it as the farthest point they'd go upstream, the geology of the place preventing them from having any choice other than the one wherein they said, "We are lost, therefore we will call this home." And close enough that as a child I had been teased by older kids who said, if I only tried hard enough, I would smell salt water. And I, believing, stood among the light poles and the gulls in the parking lots of A&Ps and cried when I knew that it was true, despite the fact that they had meant to lie, as children sometimes do. The house itself rested above one of many ponds and streams meandering down to the James like so many pieces of unwound rope. On the other side, Richmond, its glass buildings sometimes reflecting the river below, or clouds, or ironworks and track nearly gone to powder with rust. There it sat, up on its escarpment, which the river had scoured out over the millennia, and still it dug farther into the earth, winding in the landscape like a salesman's banner, unfurling to reveal his wares. Back home, everything had begun to remind me of something else. Every thought I had blossomed outward and backward until it attached itself to some other memory, that one leading to another, impermanent, until I was lost to whatever present moment I was in. "Honey, do you mind fixing the fence out by the pond?" my mother would say in the shortening days of summer. And I would walk into the long expanse of the yard holding a hammer and a fistful of nails. And I'd reach the fence and lean on it, looking out over the water as warm breezes made it ripple, and I'd be brought back. Back to what? To nothing. To everything. The yelp of dogs echoing out from where they rolled in wet garbage in the shadow of the Shamash gate. If I heard the caw of ugly crows swing down from the power line that they adorned in black simplicity, the caws might strike in perfect harmony with the memory of the sound of falling mortars. And I at home now might brace for the impact. "Come on, you motherfuckers," I'd think, "you finally got me." And then as the birds took flight, I would remember, and I'd look back and see my mother's face silhouetted in the kitchen window, and I'd smile back at her and wave, take the loosening wire meshing of the fence, and begin to nail it back in place. You want to fall, that's all. You think it can't go on like that. It's as if your life is a perch on the edge of a cliff, and going forward seems impossible. Not for a lack of will, but a lack of space. The possibility of another day stands in defiance of the laws of physics, and you can't go back. So you want to fall, let go, give up, but you can't. And every breath you take reminds you of that fact. So it goes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I thought we could just kind of see where that takes us. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm also a veteran of Vietnam, 11 Bravo. Like
Oh,
you.
right.
And that's infantry, for the machine gun also. But, I'm just really curious. I read your book. Actually, I heard it.
Mm-hmm.
It's an audio book.
Right.
And really, I guess a two-part question. One is, why didn't you do the recording? I'm curious.
Right.
But the second thing is, going into the Army, what did you identify as? Did you identify as a poet going in who was you know, seeking to serve his country, or
Right.
seeking an experience, or did you identify as a patriot who wanted to go in and discovered that you were a poet during that experience?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I should probably. I was a 12 Bravo, so.
Oh, you were?
Yeah. So I was a combat engineer, and we were, you know, my platoon would be attached to variously infantry battalions and cavalry squadrons. So.
But you got the CIB also.
Yeah. Well, they changed it up a little bit. Now they've got the CAB.
CAB. Okay.
Yeah. So you know, it's hard to. You know, when I think back, you know, I had to get my parents' permission. I signed up when I was 17 years old. What exactly I identified as? I mean, I joined the Army because I come from a family where that's kind of a common choice. Not from a career military family, but my father had served in the Army. My uncle was a Marine. Both of my grandfathers had served. And it seemed to me that the men in my life who I admired all seemed to have this thing in common. You know, I don't come from a poor family by any means, but I thought the Army would open up opportunities for me that I might not have otherwise. You know, to go to, you know, the school of my choice, that kind of thing. And I did think it was an honorable way of serving and getting something in return. You know, this kind of exchange. I felt like it was, it just seemed like a natural choice. But at the same time, I was also, as I mentioned to the ladies I was talking to earlier, I was kind of a natural observer of things. And, you know, poetry was a natural kind of place for me to put those observations and to ask those questions about the way I experience the world. You know, it's always a kind of a very fluid thing when I reflect back on who I was or who I thought I was at the time. I think I had some sense of wanting to keep that particular part of my life, the poet in me, whatever that was, to keep that private. I wanted to protect it. So it wasn't something I really identified with when I was in the military. But, you know, as I went on, I realized that it was kind of my natural state of being, and I became more comfortable with accepting who I was. You know, it's an interesting question. Yeah. Did I get the second part of that? I'm sorry.
I have a question. If you could do it again, would you go into the military?
Well, it's really hard to say. I mean, again, it's not.
You were only 17 when you went to Iraq?
No, I was 17 when I joined the Army, but I went to Iraq after I'd been in for a few years. There are certainly aspects of my service that I appreciate, and I look back on with, if not always fondness, with a certain respect. I mean, it did contribute to the kind of person I am.
If you ever had a son, would you want them to go?
No.
No.
But again, it's you know, I just think of what my mother went through, the kind of war that she had to fight, of wondering if I was going to be okay every day. And to be honest with you, I don't know that I have the courage to endure something like that, or the fortitude to endure something like that. It's a different kind of challenge. So I don't know the answer. I still think that the vast majority of people who join the military do so with honorable intentions.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have, I am less inclined to trust the people who are in positions to make the kind of decisions that result in those boys being sent, those boys and young women being sent all over the world. So that's a different question. I don't know the answer, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the answer.
Thank you.
As you were serving, did you stay with your poetry? Did you find you were journaling to your own experiences? Is that what led to this book? How did you pull this all together?
Well,
during your service or after?
Yeah, so no, I mean, I just didn't have the mental energy to write when I was over there. I tried in the beginning. It was important for me to have a kind of lifeline to books. I mean, that's always been an essential part of my life. So my mother would actually send me books in care packages. And some days I wouldn't read anything, some days I'd read a page and a half. But that was really important to me. When I got home, and again, people would start asking me about my experience. Because writing has really been the only satisfactory way I've ever found to really contend with the questions I have, not just about being a soldier, but what it means to be a person in the world when the world is often so terribly confusing. It was natural for me to turn to writing to think about those questions in particular. And part of that process of exploring my memories, of acknowledging that my memories were, often unreliable, and but also the only thing that I had to rely on. That I think became part of the book. It became part of the story. This idea of kind of trying to excavate your own memories and see what kind of story you can tell out of that. So it was an important part of the process and of thinking about my experience, and it became I hope anyway, it became an important element of the book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
What percentage of the book is fictionalized? I found myself wondering that, but I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
And I'm also wondering, now that your book is in print, do you find yourself, as you're reading it, lamenting choices you've made along the way? Find yourself editing periodically your work?
Yeah.
As you're reading the last 10 passages now?
Yeah. So the first part, it's difficult to kind of nail down a percentage.
Mm-hmm.
The events of the book, the actual kind of the narrative is made up. I mean, what these characters go through, the things that they do and the things that they see. I mean, in some cases it's, obviously my exposure to the kind of environment that makes its way into descriptions, but the things that they do, that's an imagined story. But particularly with the narrator, the interior life of the narrator, the things that he thinks about, the concerns that he has, the fears. That parallels my experience probably to a larger degree than I even realize. I think that's unavoidable, when the questions are so rooted in my experience, and I'm looking for a way to express those questions. The story was an attempt to kind of distill them down to something that people could access without needing that firsthand experience. The second part of the question, everything I ever write, there's a certain half-life of satisfaction, and it varies. So, I think that's just being a writer. Is you kind of get to a point where it feels finished, and then you move on. And if circumstances kind of keep you going back to it, then there are things I would do differently. But I read certain parts, but I haven't looked at it as a whole in a while, just because I've kind of moved on to other things, and but I would always do things differently no matter what it is that I read. It's just I can't help myself. I'd probably make it worse. Yeah, it's probably good that it's stuff that I did.
That's the hard part of creating.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, when I was reading the book, when you named your character Bartle, is there any connection to Bartleby, the Scrivener?
So I was trying to, when I was thinking of names for the characters, and I thought, what is this guy about? Like, what is his, is there some sort of fundamental part of his being that I can sort of express in a name? you know, that character has always been really important to me. In fact, my high school English teacher used to always say to me that I was just like Bartleby because I would prefer not to whenever she asked me to do anything. So it's just something that, you know, it's a character that's been on my mind a lot, and it seemed this kind of withdrawal from life that Bartleby experiences seemed to have some kind of resonance with. So that, I mean, that was pretty much it. I just wanted to find a name that it seemed suited to him. But yes, it's just, I just left off B. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So my 18-year-old son is reading this book right now for a class he's taking in high school.
Oh, wow.
Why War?
Yeah.
So I'm curious what your thoughts are, knowing that it's making an impact now, down sort of at this level, and what message you might want these, you know, younger readers to come away with.
Well, so I mean, the only message that I really have, or that, you know, I hope people make their own kind of decisions about what the story is saying about that experience. But I really want to make sure that people have an example of this kind of story on an individual level, that they'll see past the uniform and recognize that in the vast majority of cases, these are young kids. Their sons, their brothers, their sisters and daughters. You know, that they're individuals with individual fears and individual concerns. One of the great things about the uniform and wearing the uniform is the kind of unity that you can draw from that, the kind of camaraderie that develops from it. But it's, I think, very easy to look at those uniforms and forget that they're individuals, that they're people that could live next door to you. So rather than what we're often presented with is this kind of idea of soldiers as being just kind of parts in a machine, this kind of policy machine or what have you, just as a reminder that they're people, and they suffer, and they regret what they have to do, and that, you know, they're that they're not in any fundamental way different from any of us, and the emotions that they experience are not unimaginable. You know, these the fact that they have this kind of response to what they experienced doesn't mean that we can't understand the way that they experience the world. Everybody knows what it's like to be afraid. Everybody knows what it's like to regret something, to have some kind of shame or guilt. So that's the kind of connection that I hope people will make to the book. And, you know, the fact that people are reading it in school is insane. I don't know. It's so but, of course, really gratifying, too. I mean, yeah. Yes, sir?
One of the ties that I found was, as I'm driving through, is, you know, Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. A similar sort of very personalized war experience story. And it just made me wonder, you know, who do you like to read? What are your inspirations for writing?
Sure. Well, I mean, you know, the end of that second passage that I read, I mean, that's So It Goes. I mean, that's straight from Vonnegut. I felt like I wanted to acknowledge the profound effect that, because I didn't read Vonnegut until I came back. I read Slaughterhouse 5, and I was just like, this guy, how is it possible that he's talking about aliens in World War II? And I mean, you know, but that's what literature does. So with regard to kind of people who have written about war, I mean, Yusef Komunyakaa is a poet who served in Vietnam. I think, you know, in my estimation, he's a national treasure. Tim O'Brien is, of course, a writer that I admire a great deal. Also, Stephen Wright, who's a really amazing, imaginative, strange writer, but he wrote a book about Vietnam called Meditations in Green. That's really weird, and I would totally recommend it. But also, you know, just poets like, you know, James Wright and Robert Haas and Dylan Thomas was kind of the first person I ever read when I was a teenager that just kind of blew me away. Marilyn Robinson's novelists I love to read. So yeah, I mean, I read fairly widely and just kind of, I don't know how those people influence me, I just know that they do, you know? Yes, ma'am.
I have a sort of a somber question. I wonder if you could speak to the legacy of violence and how you learned to live with that and what you think that is in your life, and also if there's a hidden gift in that for you.
No, I think that's a really good question. And for me, the way that I think about it, what people go through when, I mean, not just soldiers at war, but anybody who's had to live through kind of experience that's that intense, and that violence is at the core of, it's in a way a kind of compression of life experience. You're dealing with a lifetime's worth of grief and again, these emotions that I keep going back to, the grief and shame and fear and regret and anger. And I think the challenge that one is faced with is how, I mean, it overloads the mechanism, right? So you have this lifetime's worth of experience, and you have to deal with it with a kind of a not very efficient processor. You know, when you're 23 or 25 or 18, as some of these people are, you're just not equipped to handle that much information, that much kind of emotional input. So it takes time to adjust to it. One of the ways I'm able to think about that now is the fact that, I mean, it's given me a profound appreciation for the fragility of life. I think very often young people don't understand how precious life is, and now that's unshakable. I mean, it's at the core of the way that I see the world. But you know, I wish there was an easier way to arrive at that kind of understanding, but it's been one of the ways that I've kind of tried to look at it as something I can learn from and something that perhaps I can share with other people. So, yeah.
Beautiful, thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, sir.
Firstly, your book was just incredible. Anybody who hasn't read it, it's really one of the best books I've read in a long time.
Well, thank you so much.
Congratulations. I wanted to ask you about, I'm always intrigued by the process of writing a book. And if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about the highs and lows. Was it a kind of catharsis for you? Did it flow? Did you have to discipline yourself? What was it like writing it?
Yeah, so for me, there are a lot of lows. It's challenging most of the time. I think one of the reasons I like writing so much is it's not really even those days when it's coming easily. It's the fact that you're constantly presented with challenges to which there are no easy answers. There are no correct answers. There's nothing definitive where you arrive at it and you say, I know this is right. This is 2 + 2 = 4. You have to rely on your instinct, and you have to kind of incrementally get closer and closer to what it is that you're trying to say or understand. I started with just writing kind of images that I had in my mind, sketching out scenes. And after I had kind of compiled this mass of material, then I had to go in and find the story, and it was to figure out where these people are making choices that seem important to me and will be hopefully important to somebody who's reading it. And you just kind of try to shape it, to distill it, just to make it better. And at some point, you just kind of go through that a certain number of times. It's always really hard. And those days when it doesn't feel hard only happen because of the days preceding it where it does feel heavy. Excuse me. So yeah, I mean yeah, I mean I didn't in my own case, I don't set myself out to have a defined schedule. I mean just nuts and bolts stuff. I tend to write 6 hours a day for 4 or 5 days out of the week. I've found that anything more kind of restricted than that just adds a degree of pressure that doesn't seem to be, ultimately it's kind of counterproductive for me, so I just sort of trust my pace and my instincts on that. But yeah, I mean it's work, you know, but it's satisfying in a way that work often is. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So you're a poet, but you're a writer,
mm-hmm.
and I'm sitting here listening to you and trying to sort of not marry the two, but try to understand how you think about the two of them, and you were telling us earlier that you're going back to writing, or that you are writing poetry, mm-hmm. and so do you think that you'd write another novel? How do the two of them feel? I mean, they're such different venues.
They are, yeah. And for me, I think primarily because I've always been interested in those two forms as a reader. I mean, that's why I'm interested in that as a writer too. I mean, I'm in the very, very early stages of working on another novel. I just finished a book of poetry that'll be out next April, so a year from now. The difference, you know, it's hard to, if a line pops into my head, I very often don't know what's going to happen to it, or where it's going to go. There's something about the immediacy of poetry. It seems to be something that you receive and you try not to mess up. And for me, prose is something more that you work with and you really can kind of shape and hammer at. And it seems more malleable, and I don't know, poetry I just try to get out of the way as much as possible, if that makes sense, you know? But yeah, I mean, it's interesting thinking about it in this way, because to me it's kind of something intuitive. The process of working in one form or another is I sort of know it when I feel it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm. And then the other question is so I've heard writers, it's interesting, the mechanics of how they write. Mm-hmm. Some writers write using a specific pen, or they write in a book, or they write on a paper, or they type, or they use a computer. How do you go through that creative process?
I generally start out with scattered ideas and things that are typically in notebooks and longhand. I don't have a special pen or anything, but no, but I get, you got to have your talismans, whenever you can find something reliable.
Well, the only reason I said is because I heard an interview with Tony Kushner, and he said that he writes with a fountain pen, the pen that he got for his bar mitzvah.
Oh.
And this is just how he writes, and a fountain pen to me would be just pain in the ass.
No, well, yeah, but routines, if you can get a routine that's organic, that can be really important. But so once I feel like I've got, a certain amount of material, then I'll sit down with the computer and just sort of figure out what I've got. With poetry, it's a little bit different. I very often will try to get a draft of a poem done and out as soon as I can, and then I'll take it and put it on the screen and see what it is. And but that's pretty much how I work. I appreciate the efficiency of the computer, and the delete button is probably my friend.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Have you received any feedback from people that are still or have been involved in the military world? Have you received any feedback from them? What's it been like?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've gotten emails from vets and from guys currently serving. kind of become sort of pen pals with a guy in Afghanistan who picked the book up when he was on leave, and it's not something that happens a lot. And I'm sure that's a kind of self-selecting group. There are probably people who read the book and didn't really feel like they wanted to get in touch with me. You know, I realize that there's probably a wide range of reactions to the book, but occasionally I'll get a message from, or there'll be somebody who comes to a reading. The people who choose to get in touch with me, I mean, it's primarily positive, which I'm happy about. Yeah, so, but it's no, it's satisfying in the same way that it is when I hear from, you know, from the families and friends of vets who feel like, you know, they've gotten slightly closer to understanding that experience of their loved one. Yeah, which is, I mean, it's really important to me. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm thinking a lot about what you say about the emotions and the individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how, and I really appreciate that, but I'm wondering how you reconcile that with a reaction at home,
Mm-hmm.
the politics of a war. And I think people miss that. I mean, I know I do, because I'm reacting just to the whole global.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering how you and how others reconcile that.
Yeah, well, for me, the way that I think about this book is that it's got a place in the kind of larger discussion. Not that it needs to be sort of definitive in any way, or that it's making any kind of statement about our national experience. I think of it as an example, as a kind of a data point or something, just something for people to think about. For me, the journalism is essential. Fiction, poetry, none of it on its own is sufficient to have a complete understanding. I don't know if a complete understanding is possible, but certainly I know that none of those things meet that kind of requirement by themselves. I think to get any kind of sort of like view that even approaches the kind of comprehensive, we have to look at hear from different voices and different approaches to the information that's out there. So I just hope that people will read the book and think of it as a kind of one piece of the puzzle, and that's really it. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel that your book is compared to the famous Remarque book?
It's of course very flattering, but it's also very strange. It's abstract to me. It's hard to feel like it's actually a part of my life. Thankfully, I'm not responsible for making those comparisons. So I mean, that part of it is strange. I'm happy that people are responding to it, but I'll be honest with you, I don't really. Yeah, I mean, I try not to think about that too much, to be honest with you.
Well, I'm so old that I grew up with that book. And now I read your book, and I survived the war barely. So I think your book is an extremely important book, not only for the beauty of the writing and so on, but also for the story and for what it makes people feel.
Well, I certainly appreciate that very much.
I'll second that.
Thank you.
We have time for another question?
Yes, ma'am.
Hearing you read the passages, it's obvious that you have a beautiful command of language, and your poet's voice showed through the descriptions. I can understand why some teachers chose that as a study in high school. Because of your writing skill.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
I enjoyed it very much.
I appreciate that. Oh, and I don't know why. Initially, they asked me to read for the recording, and then they got an actor to do it.
Well, it's nice to finally hear your voice.
So how does he compare to the reader?
Pardon me?
How does his voice compare to the reader?
I think you'd have done a great job.
Yeah, well, I have heard that the person who did the recording is fantastic.
Yes.
I haven't been able to bring
He's
myself
got
to
that
listen to
acting.
But I've people
I have
people
faith, man.
people have said he did a really great job.
So, anyone have another question, or shall we sign books? I know you're happy.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just before I say something, I missed the beginning. When you came home from the war, were you for the war or against it?
Oh, when I came home, I was against it. Actually, when I was there, I was pretty much against it. Yeah, no, I mean it was I talked about this a little bit, but when I was younger, when I signed up, I had a certain amount of faith in that the people, our representatives would only send me to war in good faith with the best intentions. When I found myself in Iraq, I lost a lot of that faith in our elected representatives. Yeah, so.
Well, when I in the 60s, when I was in the military, I was like 20, and most of the fellows were 19, 18,
Right.
21, and they were, you put a gun in their hand and send them to Vietnam or wherever, and people are shooting at you, so you defend yourself.
Right.
And you don't have time to think about it too much. But we had some people that were 23, 24, 25-ish,
Mm-hmm.
they were much harder they were much more independent and harder to control.
Right.
And one last thing is, I think this war is a male thing. More of a male thing. It's becoming more feminine.
Sure.
But I'm surprised at all the women here for a war talk, because I would think it would be more men. But I mean, I know there's.
Because we have sons.
We have sons.
That's a little Let's talk about that some more. Let's air that. That got the room buzzing. That just lit things up.
Yeah. I think that's true.
Yeah, but you captured the feminine side.
Well, and I mentioned in my own life acknowledging not just the challenges that the soldiers face, those young men and women, but the families and those. I just think my mother and the mothers play an important role in the book. The kind of war that they have to fight, the kind of suffering that they endure, that was something that I really wanted to have as a kind of primary element of the book. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to add, because I'm part of a hereditary group that traces our ancestry back to the American Revolution, and so we talk a lot about war and relationships, and the fact in my mind that when somebody in a family is in active duty military, the whole family serves. It impacts everybody
That's
in
true.
the family.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not just a bunch of guys with guns. They're
right.
people at home who love them and who are sincerely worried. There are children at home without dads or mothers.
Right.
And
That's absolutely
it's a whole
true.
family who serves.
That's absolutely true, and it's an important and infrequently acknowledged fact of our military, particularly now that the percentage of people who are dealing with that directly is decreasing. I mean, so yeah, I think it's important to point that out.
Well, I think this could get very lively. I want to make sure we have time to sign books, and thank you, Kevin. If you haven't had a chance, Kevin's book is at all the registers. And,